Today is November 10th, 2015. I'm here in Merle Davies on the Beaverton High School campus with Kjell Krane, who was at Beaverton High School in 1957 to 1959 before he went to Sunset High School when the high school opened and graduated from there in the class of 1961. I'm here to interview him for an oral history project called Discovering Those Who Serve Our Community, and my name is Leslie Franks. You can just tilt this way so we can just have a chat if you want.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Thanks for coming. It's really an honor to have you here. So, in the poster that I wrote up for kids to sign up today, I told them at the very beginning that when in 1968, when you had graduated from 1967, when you graduated from college, you were up in Washington, and you were a smoke jumper, putting out fires. You had just gotten your degree at Oregon State, and this was your summer job. This is how you put yourself through school. And you get a phone call from your mother. And your mother's kind of quavery on her voice, and she's telling you that a good friend of hers sits on the draft board, and she just found out that you are about to be called up for service in the draft, and you probably would get that letter in September of 1967. So the first thing you do is you get on a bus and you go down to Portland and start knocking on the doors of the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, to see if you can become an officer. If you would just explain to me why you wanted to be an officer, why you wanted to beat the draft letter.
I wanted to have some control over my life, and I knew that if I went in as an enlisted man, if I was just drafted, I most certainly would go into the Army, because the Navy and the Air Force had thousands of people on a waiting list to get in, because nobody wanted to go to Vietnam and walk through rice paddies with a rifle and maybe step on a landmine and have your legs blown off. So that was just a nightmare for a lot of us young guys, and so I thought if I could get commissioned as a lieutenant, I would have some, not a great deal of control. I couldn't say I want to be sent to the U.S. Army in Germany, but I thought maybe this war will end before I'm fully trained and sent overseas. So I tried to get into the Air Force and the Navy, and I was far too late. They couldn't even process my application for 6 months, so I knew I just had days. Once the letter is sent by the draft board, you don't even have to open it. Once it's sent and postmarked, then that's considered notice to you that you are to report for active duty. And at that point, they can assign you to any branch of the military they want. And like I said earlier, everybody was going to the Army. There was just no exceptions. And a lot of my friends had already been taken. So I tried very hard, talked to the Navy, the Air Force, the National Guard, and they all just shook their heads. And as I was leaving, I saw the U.S. Marine Corps recruiters had the door open to their office. This all took place down at the main post office in Portland. They were all on one floor. And I stopped in to talk to them. I told them I have a college degree. And they suddenly sat up and said, wow, oh, okay, you're physically healthy. And I said, yeah, I'm working on firefighting, and so that they said, we can process you in 7 days. And I filled an application out quickly, and I went home, and I think it was on the 4th day, the phone rang, and it was, I remember, this is Staff Sergeant Peterson down at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in Portland, Oregon. Can you be here tomorrow at 1 o'clock to be sworn in? You may bring 2 family members. And my mother and my older brother came with me. And that's the way it's all started. They were not able to take me directly, so they told me that I couldn't leave the United States, and that I actually belonged to the United States Marine Corps, and if I wanted to leave, I needed permission. But they thought I would report for active duty in February of the next year. So I had about 4.5, 5 months.
So in February of that next year was when the Tet Offensive began, is that right?
It actually, yeah, it did. That's correct. And I reported for active duty on February 19th in Quantico, Virginia.
Okay. Can you just speak to what was going on in Vietnam, what your thoughts were at the time? I remember you mentioned a little bit about what President Johnson was saying as you signed those papers.
Yeah, it was, my father hadn't served in the military. He grew up in Norway, came to the United States following his older brother, and married an American school teacher in Iowa. And so he couldn't really give me any advice, and it was just very, very difficult for him to talk to either me or my younger brother, who also was facing the draft. So we watched a lot of evening news. I knew there were a lot of deaths, and every week there were lots of bodies coming home from Vietnam. And so I was very apprehensive. I just surely did not want to get killed in a war that was 11,000 miles away from my home in Cedar Mill, Oregon. So but I had to make a choice. Either that or leave and go to Canada or to Sweden, because neither of those countries would extradite you. If you ran from the draft board, the FBI was after you immediately with an arrest warrant. And I just couldn't do that. So I decided I'll cut the best deal I can for myself, and I wound up in the Marine Corps. But I did sign a contract where they said, if you make it through officers training, which is 3 months, we will, because I thought I would like to fly, to be trained as a pilot. So they said, we will allow you to start your pilot training. If you wash out of either one of those, officers training, and you don't get commissioned as a lieutenant, then we have you to do what we want with you. And I knew I'd be packing a rifle, and I'd be walking through those rice paddies. So I had to make it through Quantico, Virginia. I got commissioned, and then I went immediately to flight school, and that took almost a year before I wound up in Vietnam.
In '69. So tell me about the day before you arrived for duty for training in 1968 when you met the draft dodgers.
Yeah, I was hitchhiking on an interstate, and there were 3 guys actually standing at this same on-ramp, and it was raining and cold, and we began to talk to each other because they were trying to thumb a ride too, and they had really long hair, and they were kind of flower children, and I had a really short crew cut, and they, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to Quantico, Virginia, because I have to start my military service. And they just laughed at me, and they said, are you stupid? You know, you can beat that draft. All you have to do is come up with a physical problem, and they'll give you an exemption. And I said, no, come on, you're kidding me. And they said, nope. What we did, they said, and he pointed 2 of them. I don't know where the 3rd guy, maybe he wasn't even a friend of theirs, but he was just trying to thumb a ride too. But he said, we learned from other people that you can break up some heavy glass like a Coke bottle, and you kind of file the edges down, and you can swallow the glass, and you get it into your stomach. And it cuts the lining of your stomach, and you will bleed, and you'll defecate blood. And you can show that I have bleeding ulcers or something terrible going on in my stomach, and the military doesn't want anything to do with you. And I looked at them, and I just thought, they're probably telling the truth. I mean, I'd kind of heard stories like that before when I was in college down at Oregon State. But they thought I was a stupid sap for, they said, are you going to do what the man says, you know, are you going to, and yes, that's what I was going to do, because I'm an American citizen, and I was not going to leave this country, because at that time the law was you can never come back, or you'll immediately be arrested and sent to federal prison for several years. And I did not want to bring that kind of shame on my family or myself.
So you went for training for a good year, and
I
then
did.
your first arrival in Vietnam was in
August
of '69.
9, yeah.
So let's look at some of the photos here. You guys can open them up if you'd like. The ones of the beaches and of the barracks, or the base.
Right.
Tell me about your first weeks there as an officer, lieutenant.
When you first arrive, you don't know anything about the countryside and where the dangerous areas are to stay away from. So you get a lot of orientation flights, and they teach you how to shoot the guns. I had some training in the Cobra, which is, it doesn't have door gunners. You can't carry any passengers. It's a very small. It's 36 inches wide, which is about the width of this chair. So you have one pilot in front and one pilot in the back, and I think there's two pictures here. One shows me just coming back from a mission, flying from the back seat, which is much bigger. The front seat is smaller, but it allows you to fire a 6-barreled Gatling gun in a turret underneath your feet, and it also allows you to fire a cannon that shoots a 40-millimeter explosive round. But it's very tight quarters. You cannot touch each other. The guy behind you, if you're shot or wounded and you're bleeding, he can't reach you, and you couldn't do anything for him either. You're both trapped in these two very small areas of the helicopter. So it wasn't my choice to fly that particular helicopter, but that's what the Marine Corps assigned me to, and you have to go for the greater good of what the military wants. You really don't have a choice.
So what was your role in terms of flying that helicopter when it came to missions?
If you start out in the front seat in the morning, then you'll burn up about 2 hours fuel. You come back and land, and then you change places. You go to the back seat, and that guy goes up front, and you're checking maps, you're talking on the radio frequencies, you're trying to find out who's in trouble, where they are. We're flying up into the mountains of Vietnam or down along the ocean, and we're trying to help, trying to defend guys on the ground that are caught in an ambush or have stepped on a mine, and they've got a lot of wounded people, yet they're surrounded by people shooting at them, and so the rescue helicopters can't come in and land and pick up the wounded and the dead. And until the gunships come and fly around and identify, we see people hiding in the brush, and we just dive on them and try and kill them as quickly as we can. So this particular photograph of the base, this is a Vietnamese fishing village just a few hundred yards away from our base. So we lived right on the coast of the South China Sea, and we were surrounded by barbed wire fences and big steel towers with people with big floodlights and machine guns, because at night the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong would sometimes swim through the surf and crawl up to the fence and try and cut away to get inside, carrying big pouches of explosives. And occasionally they did get in, but usually they would set off alarms, and the floodlights would come on, and the guys in the tower would open up with machine guns. They never tried during the day, always at night, but and several times rockets were fired from several miles away that were set up and landed right into our base and would blow up, and tremendous explosion, and sometimes they would hit a sleeping area and kill or wound people. So there was a lot of interruptions at night. It was very hard to sleep over there. Helicopters were being worked on at night, and they'd start the engines up 1 o'clock in the morning to adjust them. So I just remember being tired all the time that I was over there.
What was your first impression of Vietnam when you got there, coming from Oregon?
The heat and the humidity. I remember when our airplane landed, and it was actually a commercial jet, a Boeing 707, and it's air conditioned, and we landed in Da Nang, where I was for the whole year, which is in the very center of South Vietnam. And when they popped the door and opened it up, all that warm, humid air rushed in with a very strong smell of vegetation, because it's a tropical country and everything has something growing on it except for the little narrow beaches and things. And it was a very pungent, strong smell of just wet earth and trees and plants and people and animals. And it was kind of ominous. It was so different. It's like the dark side of the moon or something. I didn't know what to think of it.
Did you get to know some of the South Vietnamese people?
I did get to meet a few of them that worked on the base. They did the laundry for us. We paid them $15 a month to wash our clothes. They just washed them in an aluminum pan. They didn't have washing machines. And maybe a couple times a month I would go. I'd get permission to leave the base and go into Da Nang, and the American military had a large, what they call a post exchange, where you could buy, at that time, music tapes and books to read, and you could buy extra socks, and you could buy an electric fan for your room, because we had no air conditioning or anything, so it was very, very humid and hot at night, and even a small little Sanyo electric fan was a real luxury and help you sleep. But I also knew that some of the children, even that were trying to sell you gum and cigarettes and things, if your Jeep slowed down in a traffic jam, they'd run up and try and sell you things and hold them up to you and kind of talk to you in broken English. But once in a while, the children had been trained to throw a hand grenade in, and they'd pull the pin and throw it and run. So you could also be killed right there in downtown Da Nang. It was not a safe city, and it was in a war zone, and some people hated us, and some people wanted us to stay, and they knew that we were there and taking a chance on dying in their country just so that they could have freedom.
Let's talk about the context of this picture in the elephant grass. Like, you took all these pictures, so right. So where were you when you took this?
A lot of them I took through the plexiglass of the Cobra, so some of them are kind of grainy and not that clear. But this one of the men that I went through all of my flight training with, he was assigned to fly the big troop-carrying helicopters, and those were the ones that did the medevacs and picked up the wounded and also picked up the dead Americans.
How big were those? How many?
They could carry, they were as long as this room is wide almost, when you consider. They had 2 engines, big set of rotor blades on the back of it, and another big set of rotor blades on the front, and very powerful, and they could carry a lot of food and water and ammunition, and but some of them were signed each day just for medevac, and they had 2 pilots in the front, and they had a door gunner on the left side with a big heavy machine gun, and the same thing on the right side, and they had a hatch that was open, and they could shoot right down into the ground if somebody was shooting at them. And then they had trained medical people, usually 2, and they had a lot of bandages and blood plasma, and because you never knew who was going to be, you'd land and they'd bring somebody in that had no hands or arms, you know, just horribly mutilated from a terrific explosion. And then, so they'd have to try and stabilize him and save his life while we flew back to Da Nang to the military hospital. And so my friend said to me one night, he said, "You guys in the Cobra, you never land down in the elephant grass or when we are putting troops in to help people that are trapped." And he was right. And I felt a little ashamed of myself because I didn't know how frightened and scared they were when they actually had to touch down and be there for several seconds while the wounded were brought on board. And he said, "You should fly with me one afternoon." He said, you'll hear and smell what we get to hear and smell." And he said, I think you'll realize how lucky you are." And I had never thought of it that way. And that seems kind of strange because I'm flying alongside these guys trying to protect them, and I eat my meals with them, and there was one that slept in the same room with me. And but so I did that, and I took my Pentax camera along, and I would lean out the open windows and take these shots. And this was a young man, a young Marine, way up in the mountains in this thick elephant grass, and the radio call came in that he had collapsed from extreme heat, and his heart had stopped. And so we happened to be flying at that time, coming back from another medevac, and we immediately went there. And he was unconscious, probably still alive. They thought they got a very weak pulse in his neck. They were doing chest compressions on him. And so we hovered about 25 or 30 feet in the air because we couldn't land in this really tall grass. And they strapped a harness around him, and yet they had to have one of his friends hold on to him and just hug him all the way up so he didn't slip out of the harness. And they have an electric winch, and they have an opening almost as big as this table in the floor of the helicopter, and they winched him up, both of them up through, and I took several shots, and this just happened to be one of them. And they brought him up inside, and they immediately unhooked him from the harness and laid him out, and they started dumping big 5-gallon cans of cold water on him, trying to shock him, and they gave him some shots to try and start his heart. And then for several minutes they gave him chest compressions. And I took a couple more pictures, and then I thought I'm going to stop. And they worked on him, and I saw one of the older medical technicians come up, and he slapped the younger medic on the shoulder, and he said, and I guess, "Stop, you know, he's dead." And so it was quite a shock to me to be right there when someone dies. And so I look at those pictures sometimes, and it takes me back to just the screaming sound of the engines that are right above your head, and the rotors beating, and you can scream at each other, but you can hardly hear each other. And so that's why you touch somebody and you tell them, you give them hand signals.
I'm really curious about the elephant grass, actually, because it looks so thick there.
It is.
And tell me about what was going on the ground a little bit in terms of navigating that, what you saw.
Yeah, the elephant grass is very sharp. It cuts your skin. It's miserable to fight your way through. And this was a Marine patrol that had been out since daylight. And they each carried 2 canteens, and they had fought their way through this elephant grass following a lieutenant was with them, and he had a compass, and they had a goal to be on a certain mountaintop by the end of the day, and they were looking for bunkers or hidden weapons, rice, food, trails that were well used. But it just is terrifying to think you're down in something that's up over your head like this and so thick, and you're fighting your way through it. And the guy on the very front of the patrol, of course, he's in the most danger and has the worst exposure to stepping on a mine or a thin wire that he trips with his foot, and a big explosion goes off. So and I know these young guys were just scared to death. And there's about another 10 or 11 guys that are fanned out in a big circle, all laying on the ground with their weapons, scared that there's going to be an ambush. Well, they get this young wounded guy lifted. I think this was probably some of the things that still results in nightmares for them. I don't know how you deal with that, your fear. They're all 18, 19 years old, and the lieutenant was probably 22 or 23. And they have a radio, and I saw on the ground were a lot of empty canteens where they had taken the precious water that they needed for themselves because they were going to be out there all day long, and they had poured their water on this young man, trying to chill his body down and bring his temperature down because it was just frying his brain, and that's why his heart stopped. And what were they going to do for the rest of the day?
We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to give some room for students to ask some questions. But I did want to ask you about when you were over there, your sense of what was going on in America. What kind of information were you getting to know that at this time in U.S. history that there was great anti-war sentiment going on in '69 and '70? Did you get that news?
Yes, I was aware of that, and only because I received letters from home, and actually my wife Ann is sitting right here, and she wrote to me and sent me sometimes headlines or things from the newspapers, and we had the Armed Forces radio station that broadcast from Saigon, and when we were up flying, if we were just going from point A to point B and we're up quite high and in no danger, we could turn our military radios and listen to current music, you know, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and also brief headlines from what was happening in the United States, and big demonstrations and people being arrested, and even bombs being planted in federal buildings. And I knew that this country was being ripped in half by the very angry feelings, people on both sides, that we should stay in Vietnam, try and protect this country. Others saying, I don't want my son or my daughter killed over there. And so people were leaving and going mainly to Canada. And I had one of my friends from Oregon State that chose to leave and went to Canada. And he's never come back. I mean, I tried to contact him about 8 years ago, and I called Oregon State University, and they told me they had an address for him in Toronto, that he had been working as a counselor at a university up there. But they said the last few people that have asked us for his address and have sent letters, they came back no longer here. So I have no idea where Bob Moore is at this time. But he was my roommate and a very close friend of mine, a very sensitive individual, and he said, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to report to the military. I refuse to carry weapons and try and kill someone, even to save my fellow Americans. So he knew he was, last time I saw him was in Portland, Oregon, and he had just been down to the federal courthouse and had a preliminary hearing. So he knew he was headed to prison. Very sad. Very difficult for me to understand, because I was home on leave and I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. So,
Of all the lessons you've learned in your service, what are some that stand out to you at you continued, actually, right? I back up a little bit. When you came home in 1970, you were still serving until 1973. I
had 3 more years of active duty, and so I continued to serve. Most of it was down in Southern California at a big Marine Corps air base there. But I, in retrospect, I guess if I'd been horribly burned or was in a wheelchair here talking to you, I'm not sure if I'd be bitter and angry about that, but it has taken me a long time to get over the emotional stress. There were 8 pilots in my squadron that were killed while I was there. So it was very hard to, you have lunch with somebody and you find out 3 hours later they were shot down and killed. And they're just gone. and nobody ever wept. I never saw anybody cry in Vietnam, but we were all officers, and we felt like we couldn't openly weep for someone. We had to provide some leadership for the younger men, but I'm glad I didn't leave. I'm glad I didn't go to Sweden. I'm glad I didn't go to Canada and leave my country. And I thought of it, especially since my younger brother was going into the Navy as a pilot just a few months after I did. I thought of the shame that my parents might feel. I never heard them say a word to me, "Don't go. We don't want to have one of our sons die in Vietnam." That we couldn't even talk about it. It was such a difficult subject. But I'm glad that I didn't. I felt like I'm an American citizen and I owe this to my community, to the people I grew up with, the people I went to Beaverton High School and Sunset with, and Oregon State, and I wanted to be able to come back and live here and not be ashamed of what I had done. And it was something I thought about a lot right up till the day I got off the train in Quantico, Virginia, and an hour later all my hair was shaved off and I had a bunch of strange clothes. They were all green, and people are screaming at me and yelling and cursing at me, and I knew it was going to be hard, and it did turn out to be very hard. I was one of the fortunate ones. I came home alive, but I certainly had a lot of nightmares and a lot of depression, and it took me years to process what happened to me over there, because I was in a helicopter. Instead of picking up wounded, we were out killing people, and they were people with rifles that were trying to kill us, or machine guns, or rockets. And we chased them down trails, we chased them along the beach. They popped out of holes in the ground and just emptied a whole clip of bullets right at our helicopter. And we turn right around and come back and dive down on them and fire rockets and just pound them with all kinds of explosives. And we realized those are human beings we're killing, and they're young people just like we were. And that's what war is. And flying over a Jeep, laying on its back with Americans in the road, some of them black from the explosion, burned horribly, waiting for the medevac birds to come in and pick them up. Those memories are stuck in my mind till the day I draw my last breath.
Thank you so much. So very
You're
much.
welcome.
I want to open it up for, oh, you want to do this? Okay, let's do that. Yeah, let's do this first. This is Elizabeth Hampton Gray, who has something she'd like to present to you.
I want to thank you for your service, and we all appreciate everything that you did. So we have this
Oh,
for
that's
you.
beautiful. Somebody's done a lot of work.
That somebody would be Elizabeth Hampton Gray. She's a quilter.
But, you know, we had a lot from our class, and John served also during that same time. And the students here, you know, you hear about it, but you didn't have to live through it. And whether we were here or in other parts of the world, war is just terrible, and you could not be here today except for all the generations of people who served. So we thank you very much. Welcome home.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead. I might repeat it for the mic, so if you...
What did you want to do before the war, before you got drafted?
What did you want to do before you got drafted, before the war?
I wanted to remain at the university down in Corvallis and get a master's degree in political science. And I had taken a lot of years of the German language here in this same high school and over at Sunset, and then while I was in university. And I thought I wanted to maybe teach a foreign language, but as I got older, my goal was to work for the U.S. Information Agency or the State Department. I thought I might be very effective living abroad, and I'd had a chance to travel quite a bit. My father came from Norway. I spoke quite a bit of Norwegian. And to tell you the truth, serving in the military just had never occurred to me. But when the situation arose, I chose to fulfill that obligation, and it changed my whole life. But in the process of serving in the military, I met my wife while I was in flight school. We raised 3 children together. They're wonderful kids. They're very responsible, talented, smart citizens that have made contributions with their own private lives. So that I would have missed out on all that. So in a strange way, my life is very rich and full because of the circumstances while I was serving in the military. I feel very, very lucky and blessed, and to be alive and not to be in a wheelchair or to have some horrible injuries to my body.
What did you do after you stopped serving in the military? Or did you stop serving in the military?
When my commitment was up 5.5 years, I went to work for a large insurance company in Los Angeles because I was a helicopter pilot with a lot of hours. And I tried to come back to Portland, Oregon with my family, and the economy was in terrible shape here. And so I got a lot of rejection letters and no job offers. So I worked for an aviation insurance company that insured big airlines, airports, Los Angeles helicopter fleet for the police department. And I investigated accidents for 3 years. And I handled claims for even big airliner crashes and things. And in a way, it was sort of like going back to Vietnam, because I was dealing with horribly injured people and families that had lost somebody on a Pan American crash or a United Airlines crash. And it was very grim and hard work, and also had to go out, climb on the mountainside when a private airplane crashed, and stand there while the coroner's office put people in rubber bags. And I know when I came home that night to my family, I was back in Vietnam again, psychologically. So it was not a good, it provided a salary. I was well paid, and thankfully after 3 years of that, the company transferred me and trained me as an underwriter. So then I was in the business of selling the insurance, going out, examining airports, going to look at Lear jets that a corporation owns and deciding how much to charge them for insurance. And I got away from that grim, gruesome side of fatal accidents and things. And then I went to work for Nike, and a friend of mine was one of the vice presidents, and he helped me get a job, and we moved back up to Oregon in 1982, I think, and I worked for Nike for 25 years and retired.
Vance, did you still have a question too?
Well, we never heard about your younger brother or older brother. Whatever happened to him?
My younger brother became a pilot in the U.S. Navy, and while I was in Vietnam, he was assigned to the Philippines, and he served a very useful and productive tour over there, and was safe, and came back to the United States, and was based in Alameda, California for another 3 or 4 years till he also was done and got out. My older brother, who graduated from Beaverton High School, had lost a kidney when he was 13 years old through sickness, and so he could not be drafted. If you had anything major wrong with you like that, you were given a classification of 4F, which means you have either serious heart murmur or something that you could not serve in the military. So he remained here in Portland and married and raised a family.
Anybody else? I would like to ask that question then. I was going to skip at the beginning about you were at Sunset High School, you were 18 years old, and you were called into the principal's office. Because I really don't think, you taught me this, and I don't think the audience really knows what was going on at that time in history. This is 1957, and the principal called you in, Principal Russell, right?
Yes, George Russell, because the law required a young male to register for the U.S. draft. You had to give an address, your name, your Social Security number, if you had one assigned by then, and most of us did. But you had to say, this is who I am. I'm 18 years old. This is where I live. And if the military needs me, they can send me a letter, and I'll have to go down and take a very thorough physical exam in Portland. And if they don't find anything seriously wrong with you, you're on your way. And it was kind of a strange, all of us, as we gradually turned 18, and I turned 18 on January 20th, and I was told to report to George Russell's office, and he pulled out some documents and filled them out and had me sign them, and he said, you know, he said, the military was good for me. He said, it helped me mature. And then I went to college, and he said, I think I was much better off and made better decisions rather than trying to go to college when I was 18. But of course that was during the peacetime. And he was a wonderful principal, and everybody loved him. He was so popular, and he was our first principal, the first principal at Sunset High School. And it was my senior year, and I thought, well, everybody else is doing it. I have to do this. It's part of being a citizen. And if I don't do it, then the federal government sends the FBI after you. So it wasn't a choice that you could turn down. And of course, a few years later, the war got really bad in Vietnam, and my friends who couldn't afford to go to college or didn't decide they didn't want to, they were drafted. And some of them, Ron Alshire was in my senior class, and his name is on the wall back in Washington, D.C., because he was killed in an ambush. Wonderful young guy who I just thought the world of. So it was very serious business, and that law was finally overturned or discontinued, I think, in 1975. And young men or women don't have to register for any draft. It's all voluntary, as you probably all know, or maybe you have older brothers or sisters that have served in the military, or even your parents. So it's a very different world now. At that time, it was a federal law, and you could not walk away from it without some very unpleasant consequences.
Mm-hmm. You also had an interesting way coming home on that. You called it the Freedom Bird. I thought that was quite unique, how you got that ride. This is 1970, right?
Right. So in August of 1970, I knew that my 12 months was coming to an end, and I had about 3 days left. And so I stopped flying. They didn't force you to go out on combat missions the last couple of weeks that you're in Vietnam. Even the guys on the ground, they tried to bring them back if they could, so that some terrible accident didn't happen right at the very end. And one evening, someone knocked on the door to my sleeping area, and they said, we have a load of prisoners, American prisoners, that we're flying back to the United States, and they're going to the penitentiary. And they have done some pretty horrible things. Some of them have shot and killed their own officers. Others have killed civilian Vietnamese that were innocent people, and they've been tried, and they've been assigned to 25-year sentences in prison. Some had been dealing drugs. Some had gone AWOL, had disappeared into the villages and hid out for several months, and were finally captured and brought back. And they said, we need officers to accompany them to make sure they're not mistreated. And I think there were about 70 prisoners, and they had sergeants that were handcuffed to them, and because these are really bad guys that had done some really violent things. And they said, you need a flight home. Are you willing to do this? Plane will land eventually in Southern California, and then you can arrange bus transportation to get to your family, because we had 30 days of leave to kind of get your head straight after you came back to the United States. So I said, sure, I'll do it. I want to get home so badly. And we accompanied them home, and it was a long flight, and we landed in the Philippines for several hours and refueled, and the radar broke down, and so we were there with all these prisoners, and they were pretty angry guys, and they knew they were going from the small prison in Da Nang, which was being hit by rocket fire and mortars, so they had to get them out of there for their own good. They were going to the Naval Penitentiary, I think in Portsmouth, Virginia. So they had nothing to lose, and they were handcuffed the whole way. Even when they went to the bathroom, I had to accompany them. A sergeant stood there with the door open to the bathroom when we were on a huge military Air Force plane, and we sat on really hard nylon, like long benches and things. It was a hard flight, and kind of very depressing, because these men, they were going back, and they brought nothing but shame with them for what they had done. So the families weren't looking forward to seeing them. Maybe they were, at least they were alive. But it was a very strange way to return to the United States.
Who did you first see when you landed?
I caught a bus to Los Angeles, and my wife Ann was living in Malibu, teaching school, and had summer vacation, and so her sister and her husband were another graduate of Beaverton Sunset, Skip Lauritsen, and he was married to Ann's younger sister, and so I called them on the phone and managed to get up there quite early in the morning, because we had landed late at night in Southern California at the Marine Corps base. And so then they drove me out to see her, and so we were reunited. It's a wonderful feeling. I hadn't driven a car in a year. I hadn't, all of these strange things, and I was very nervous. Even a car backfiring on the freeway would scare me, because it sounded just like a mortar shell going off that had landed on the base, and it took me many years to finally process what had happened.
Well, I thank you so much for being here today. And
You're
thank
welcome.
you for sharing your stories.
You're welcome.
Very much.
All right.
Okay.